Hello and welcome to another edition of U.S.-Japan Council's Japanese American and Japan Legacies series. I'm Deborah Nakatomi. Diane Fukami and I are your hosts for this series, highlighting the lives and journeys of prominent Japanese American leaders, each of them pioneers in developing the U.S.-Japan relationship. Through their stories, we explore the role of Japanese Americans in strengthening U.S.-Japan relations and how their experiences with Japan have contributed to their Japanese American identity and our community. We'd like to thank the U.S.-Japan Council for providing this opportunity to share these unique and powerful stories. We would also like to thank our friends at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their invaluable support of this program and of Japanese American leaders to nurture the U.S.-Japan relationship. Today, we are pleased to have with us Susan Morita, partner of Arnold & Porter, Kay and Scholler, and USJC board member. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Very nice to be sitting with you today. So we're really anxious to get started and have you start by telling a little bit about your family history. You were raised with deep cultural connections to your grandparents and also to Japan. Share with us some of those early memories of growing up.
Sure. So I was born in Chicago, and I was lucky enough for the first 9 years of my life to live very close to my grandparents, and we saw them on almost a daily basis. My grandfather was a Buddhist priest on my mother's side, and he has a little bit of an interesting story. He comes from a family in Nagoya, and the three brothers were really slated to take over the family business. But he got ill as a young child, and he had a very devout mother who prayed every day and who promised to take, if he got well, that she would give him to the church. And so thankfully he got well. And as a young teenager, he was sent to train to be a minister. And because churches in Japan are really handed down through families from father to son, and since he did not come from a church family, he didn't have a church. And so he decided that he would come overseas. And he was originally slated to be sent to Brazil, which would have been a whole different story. But he was sent to Canada and then eventually to Portland, Oregon. So his ministry was to the first generation Issei mostly. And, so our community was very much in the Japanese American community. And my grandmother was also an Ikebana teacher. And she was incredibly, I think, for a woman of her generation, the principal breadwinner, because the community was not wealthy. So my grandfather was not getting a lot of income from the church. And she truly was, as I look back on it now, really kind of an entrepreneur. She, had classes, I think 3 times a day, 4 days a week. And then on Friday, she did Japanese flower arranging for the restaurants in the Chicago area. And she would, to get her materials, she would go to the wholesaling, florists, but often she was getting materials off the side of the road. We would go on these drives out to the countryside and, the cattails would be growing, or we'd go to the beach and get these huge pieces of driftwood and put them on top of the car. And not a few times we got stopped by the police. But, I think I'm very lucky to have grown up in a family, starting with my grandmother, of very strong women. And so the idea that, I could do anything, there were no limits. And I feel very fortunate in that regard, but also, with the Ikebana and the Buddhist church and being so much a part of the Japanese American community, I really grew up in an environment where the Japanese culture was very, very central.
I remember you also told us that moving as a child also had a great influence in your life and how you saw yourself in the world. I think you mentioned that you moved at like before you were the age of 10 or 9 or 10, you moved again to San Diego. Tell us what that was like, with just as a young child having to get accustomed to, a new city, new friends, new school.
Absolutely. Yes. So my father was a cop. He was a policeman with the Cook County Police Department in Chicago, but then changed jobs and became a special agent with US Customs. And once he got that job, we started moving around quite a bit. So when I was 9, we moved from Chicago to a suburb of San Diego called Chula Vista, which is very close to the Mexican border. And we were there for less than a year, and then moved to Northern Virginia, where my father was at headquarters in DC. And we were there for about less than a year. And then we moved to Tokyo. And we were in Tokyo, I was 11 to 16 for 5 years. So it was a lot of moving around, and I was often, the new kid at school, but I wasn't really fazed by it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the new experiences and the new people. I think it has informed kind of my approach to life generally. And being in Japan was truly, I think, a life-shaping experience. I went to a small international school called Nishimachi International School for 4 years. There were a dozen kids in my 9th grade class. And so there's a special relationship you have with your teachers, your classmates, and with your education when you're in a small, that's our basketball team, a very small basketball team. And believe me, I wouldn't have played basketball if I were at a US public school, I'm sure. But this gave me an opportunity. So, and also, so I went to the international school for 4 years, and then to the American school in Japan for my 5th year. But going to school with people from all over the world, I think really changed my perspective, informed my perspective. I think your oyster just becomes, a lot bigger.
For many of us Japanese Americans who go to Japan, it's such a surprising, it's such a surprise, because I know that when I first went, I thought I was going to look like everybody else and, just fit in. And I realized that there are some real cultural identity issues that I had to work through. Talk a little bit about your experience in that regard.
Okay. Yes. It was very interesting. And I was there in the 70s, which was a different time than now, where there were just not a lot of foreigners. Now there are many foreigners and many of them speak Japanese, but at the time, Westerners were still something of a novelty in Japan. And so it was interesting for me to be there as a Japanese American. And I already spoke some of the language because I learned from my grandparents. But it was interesting to be, going to the Ginza or traveling. We went to Nikko, with friends of mine who were blonde haired and blue eyed, and who were being made quite the fuss over, by the Japanese. So we would go shopping in the Ginza, and my friends would be stopped and they would be asked for their signatures, their autographs. People would want to take pictures with them, study we practice their English with them. But no one was interested in me because they assumed, I think, I looked like them, that, I was Japanese. And so it was an interesting kind of reckoning at some point, or recognizing, what it meant to be a Japanese American and to be an American, in Japan, and kind of feeling part of that culture, but actually feeling very American in many ways. So, I have to say that I'm embarrassed now, but I wanted people to know I was American, so I would walk into stores and I would speak English, just to let people know I'm with these blind people too, and I speak English too. And it's a very silly thing, but it is, I think, one of those things, as we work out our identities, and how we want to be known and recognized, that, you just kind of work through.
And you were lucky because you had such Japanese cultural roots back when you were a kid. Let's turn a little bit to your siblings because I know that they played an important part of your life, and you weren't the only one who was exposed to that, but your brother and sister as well. Talk a little bit about you, the family unit, and what happened here in the States with grandma and with Oba-chan and Oji-chan and your parents in terms of getting the exposure that many of us didn't have.
Yeah, I think we all, grew up with that culture. I think it's all very, very much a part of who we are and our lives. My brother actually ended up spending a good deal of his professional career in Japan. He worked in marketing for McDonald's Japan. And there we are. So this picture is actually a picture of the three of us at one of my grandmother's flower arranging shows. So she had hundreds of students, and she would rent out the McCormick Place in Chicago, and would, over the space of several days, would have a show, and many dignitaries would come and so forth, and we would dress up in our kimonos and participate in the Japanese flower arranging demonstrations and so forth. So we all grew up with that culture. And as I say, my brother spent a good deal of time in Japan. He ended up marrying a Japanese woman, and his kids grew up in Japan for a significant part of their lives. So they're very bicultural, bilingual. My sister has spent less time in Japan, and she has lived in New York, and now lives in Boston and Maine. But nonetheless, she continues to, I think the food and different cultures and the language continues to be a part of all of our lives.
So as the eldest, did grandma kind of recruit you and you stayed with the Ikebana maybe longer than your siblings?
Well, I was fortunate in that my parents moved to DC, which is where I live, very shortly after I moved here. And then eventually my grandparents came and lived in the same area. So when I was raising I'm very fortunate also that my mother has watched my kids from the time my oldest was 6 months old when I went back to work after maternity leave. And since my grandparents were here, my mother would bring them, and particularly my grandmother after my grandfather passed, every day. And so my own children had this multi-generational, my mother was here, and then my grandmother was here as well. So when she was here, and before the kids were born, and then into beyond when my first was born, I would go down every weekend and I would do a Japanese flower arranging lesson with her. And then, afterwards we would have chai and sit and talk. But, I love Ikebana. I am very analytical. I was trained as a lawyer. And so I know the rules, I know what proportions, I know how you're supposed to do this. And I do it from my head, unfortunately. And so I can do maybe a passable, arrangement, but my grandmother was truly the artist. And it was so wonderful to watch her. She'd take my arrangement and she'd just twist something a little bit or bend it a little more or just clip a few leaves here and there, and the arrangement would just open up. And she was truly an artist, and it was wonderful for me to see that. And, through Ikebana, you also learn about Japanese pottery, and, that has been an interest as well. So I feel very fortunate to have had that time, and my kids would do a little bit too as they got older. But I can't claim to truly do Ikebana, but I am a student of it, and I do love it.
We'd now like to move a little bit into some other areas. After international school in Japan, how was that transition to college? And also you made a decision that you wanted to go to Stanford. And how did that decision come about? And what was that transition like? Also going back to the cultural piece of being a Japanese American in Japan and then now suddenly being back in the US again as a student.
Right. And so I did 2 years of high school in Japan, or I did my sophomore year, and then I came back. And I think I was fortunate that at ASIJ, I'd say, 90+% of the students go to college. And we, I don't know that this is necessarily the best practice, but they would have a board up, a bulletin board. And as the seniors got accepted to colleges, that got posted. And there were students at the school who, I admired very much, who went to Stanford. And that was really kind of the first time I heard about Stanford. But the college process was so much different than it is today. I think, I was lucky not to have some of the pressures that the kids go through today, but a much more kind of informal process. So I just applied to a bunch of places, got into a bunch of places. And, we were living in Washington, D.C. And so the idea of going far away from home was also very attractive to me, and just to do something kind of very different. So I chose Stanford, and I went to Stanford, and it was a wonderful experience. I really do believe, there are lots of great schools, but I'm very loyal to Stanford. I think it's a great school. It's a great place to be an undergraduate. I had a wonderful time there. And one of the things, one of the organizations that I was involved in was very much related to kind of US-Japan kind of educational and cultural exchange. There was a group called the KO Committee, a very informal group, but we welcomed students from the KO University. During their break, they came to Stanford, and they didn't take classes, but we found them host families in the area. We stayed with them, and then we would take them around, and we would go on these incredible trips. It's amazing to me now that we did it at the time, but we would go to Yosemite, we took them to Tahoe, we took them to LA, we did Disneyland. It was really a lot of fun. And this is a picture of one gathering of the KO Committee, and they're both the Japanese students from KO and the Stanford students who were part of the committee. And the Stanford students would, some of them, go to Japan over our summer break. So in this picture, you'll see I'm there, but James Higa, you'll see there's a lot of connection with USJC and this little KO committee. So James Higa, you're circling him now, and who everyone knows. And then Ken Hodo, who is also been affiliated with USJC and was the head of Accenture in Japan, is the guy who's laying down in the front, right there, right with the glasses. But there are others as well. So I can think of, so it's James, Ken Hodo, Gerald Hane, who is also a member of USJC and I think is now in Tokyo with Hitachi. And Russ Kawahara was part of the KO committee. He was a few years ahead of me, but he is part of the leadership of USJC in Tokyo, in Japan. And of course, all of Takeshi Minami, who was with Mitsubishi and then Lawson's and now with Suntory, and enormously successful and a great supporter of USJC. He was one of the KO students who came over, and he came over on a little bit of a longer program, but he was definitely part of our group as well. And then, of course, we all, Dan Okimoto was very much, was on the faculty at Stanford, was a great personal mentor and friend of mine when I was at Stanford. But I think we were all lucky, all of us in the KO committee, to be sort of in Dan's orbit. His orbit is so large, but we were all part of that. And he was a teacher and a mentor and a friend to many of us. And this is another picture of the KO committee. And again, you can see I'm there. James is right behind me. James.
Yeah.
And then again, Ken Hodo is in the front with the cup on his head. So very much college days. So,
now we recognize James Higa
yes.
standing by the coat stand, the coat hooks.
Yeah.
So Stanford was a great place of developing new friends and new relationships. And you also met someone else who would factor pretty significantly in your life when you were at Stanford.
My husband. Yes, absolutely. In fact, he was part of the KO committee as well. In fact, we both headed the KO committee in successive years. But absolutely. And it's kind of a fun story with my husband because we met at Stanford. But it turned out that our family histories were very much woven. And, I think the Japanese American community is not that large. And so often there are, small degrees of separation. But in our case, he's from Chicago. I was born in Chicago, was there for my first 9 years. But my mother's family and his mother's family both were in Portland, Oregon before the war. And my grandfather had the biggest physical church in Portland. So it was the site, that was where the Japanese American community got together for their Japanese movies, where the high school kids had their dances. It was a very much a central part of the community. So his mom's family certainly knew my grandfather and the church from that, being together in Portland. Both families were then in Minidoka, the incarceration camp, together. And all of the ministers in the camp had an office together. And it turned out that my husband's mother was the secretary to all of those ministers. That was her job in camp. So she worked with my grandfather in camp. And then eventually both families moved to Chicago, and both families are large families. So my mother's family is a family with 5 kids, and my husband's family, his father's family actually ended up having like 10 kids. And so the aunts and uncles who knew each other, we have aunts who went to art school together. My aunt, one of my younger aunts, took kendo lessons from my husband's father. So I am sure that I would go with my aunt to these lessons. And my husband took those lessons from his father. So I'm sure we were in the same spaces and places at the same time, but we didn't actually meet each other till we were at Stanford. And it was when he saw, I had a picture of my grandparents on my bulletin board in my dorm room, and he came and saw the picture and recognized my grandparents fairly early on. And that's when we realized that there was this connection. So when we got married in Chicago. It was, our wedding was sort of beside the point, it was kind of a reunion and very fun from that perspective.
It's a fascinating family story. It is just so interesting, all of the connections. So we want to spend a little time talking about Stanford and your studies, because at a fairly early stage, you knew it was international relations. What did you envision for yourself? What were you thinking about in terms of career and interests?
Right. So it wasn't really so early, and it wasn't so easy. And particularly if you talk to my husband, he will tell you that he laughs about the amount of time and angst and discussion I had with everybody about what my major was going to be. Because my first love is English literature. And I really love reading. I love stories. And I thought that maybe that was what I would do. But I think my experience in Tokyo, being overseas for one, but also then going to school with kids from all over the world, really opened up the possibility of international relations and made that a very attractive option for me. And I did eventually, I think, I just felt that I wanted to be on the ground in the world, kind of working on real world problems. And so international relations was where I finally ended up. And Dan Okimoto was part of that as well. I took his class on, Japanese politics and US-Japan relations. And so that kind of moved me along as well. So I thought I was going to be a diplomat. I thought that would be, to really be working at very senior kind of high levels in terms of relationships between countries, and sort of, creating a world order with stable relationships between countries. And I thought that was what I would do. And as I was thinking about this and having this conversation with myself, my husband was training to be a doctor. And he told me, he needed to be licensed to be a physician, and there was no way that he could move every few years, to follow a spouse in the foreign service. So I was actually working at the State Department at the time in an internship, and we were, as interns, were having talks and lunches with different, divisions or bureaus within the State Department. And one of the lunches we had was with the Legal Advisor's Office, which is sort of the legal, where the lawyers sit at the State Department. And they, negotiate treaties, negotiate international agreements. It's kind of public international law. And so I thought that would be something that could be really, really interesting. So I, ended up going to law school, and then doing a joint degree program and doing a master's degree in public policy, public administration as well. And I thought I would go to a law firm for a couple of years, get some training, and then end up in the government. And that actually never happened. But it's been great to be at the firm, but I've been there for a very, very long time.
So where you are now is where you started? That was your first legal position?
Yes, I have been. I did a lot of different, because I had the joint degree program. I had a lot of summers, and I split those summers. So I did a lot of different things. I worked at USTR, where I was Glenn Fukushima's intern. So did a lot of things. But I entered the law firm 32 years ago. Long time ago.
Well, congratulations. I'm sure they're happy to have you there for so long. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do, because although you didn't get into diplomacy per se, a lot of the work that you do is very US-Japan related, very, very much of a business and a personal diplomacy.
Absolutely. So when I entered the firm, this was in 1988. It was at the height of the US-Japan trade wars. And it's hard to kind of remember those times now, but it was at a time when Americans in the US were feeling very, very threatened by Japan and its ascendant economic power. So US companies and US industry were bringing unfair trade practice cases against Japanese companies. So when I entered the firm, I actually, and I having had a background in my master's program in international trade and international economic policy, I entered the trade practice. And so we were representing Japanese companies who were accused of dumping and unfair trade practices by American companies. So I did that work, which is really kind of a litigation and administrative law practice for a while, but also was doing some corporate transactional work. And at the time, the firm had just opened, it was opening a Tokyo office. And so I was interested in going there. And I think they thought if they could get a young attorney who had training in both of these areas, that would be a great thing. So I did both. But I eventually, when the trade war subsided, there weren't as many cases being brought against Japanese companies. And I got more and more involved in the transactional work. And as you suggest, and as I think about it, I think that I never did, join the State Department. I never did become a diplomat, but I do feel that the work that I've done on the transactional side has been very much kind of connecting US and Japanese business and companies. So, I do M&A work. So we're helping Japanese companies come to the United States to do business, and helping US companies go to Japan, although that work often tends to be done by Japanese firms that we partner with. But nonetheless, and it's just been wonderful I love my clients, and have, developed really great, wonderful relationships over the years. And, I think helping them understand and make business decisions in a US business context, and a US legal context, deal work is fun, but having that cultural overlay, and in particular with, Japanese companies and with the connections to my own heritage and so forth. And I have to say, I love I do, where we do purchase and sales agreements where people are purchase and sale transactions where companies are buying a Japanese company will come and buy a US business or, company or assets, or whatever. But I have always really enjoyed the joint venture work in particular. And I find those transactions just kind of on the merits, just more interesting, because it's a marriage. You have two companies coming together who are undertaking some sort of joint enterprise. And it's much more complicated than, a sale where you come in, you buy, you exchange the money, exchange the assets and, the stock, and everybody hopefully goes their own way. They come back, it's usually because there's been a problem in the transaction, so that's not always a good thing. But with joint ventures, you're really coming together for some significant period of time to undertake some joint enterprise. And the issues that arise in terms of, even among, two American companies, in terms of governance, how are you going to govern this entity, but also the merging of corporate cultures, they raise a lot of very fascinating, interesting issues. And when you've got the cultural overlay with a Japanese company and US company, joining forces to do this, it's really fascinating and very interesting. So I feel like it's been a little bit of private diplomacy, perhaps, kind of bridging the cultures.
One of the questions that come up with some of our USJC members who do work in Japan is language fluency. Now, you've had a whole lot more exposure to Japanese language than most of us have. Do you use that in your business transactions, and how does that factor in?
Right. So I use it, but I don't use it on an everyday basis. I feel that most of the companies that we represent are very large, sophisticated Japanese companies, and their law departments and the people who work there, frankly, their English is better than my Japanese. And when I'm dispensing, legal advice, I want to be very precise, and I don't want there to be kind of misunderstandings and so forth. So typically, I don't use it. I'm not using it in my everyday business, but there are times when it is helpful, and I do use it when it is helpful. And so examples are, for instance, when I was doing the trade work, for instance, when you do those cases, you're dealing with people in the legal department in the first instance, but the way those cases are done, you're ending up having to do work with people in kind of the internal workings of the company. So people in the advertising department, people in the accounting department, the warranty department, et cetera. And those folks did not take those jobs because they wanted to do international work, or because they wanted to do their English and use their English, and in fact, usually quite the opposite. So in those situations, it was very, very helpful for me to be able to speak with them in Japanese. And there have been cases also where sometimes Japanese executives have come to the United States and sometimes working in US subsidiaries here, and their language capabilities are not that strong, and particularly at the beginning. And it can be helpful to have some of those conversations in Japanese. And right now I'm working on a matter where a lot of the documentation turns out to be in Japanese. And so I'm able to read some of that, sometimes with the help of a dictionary, but I do my best. But so it is definitely helpful. And then when we go out socially, some of those conversations are in Japanese as well. So I think it's helpful to be able to speak the language.
So Susan, I imagine when you started in this work in your earlier years at the firm, that the business environment was really quite different, and often you would find yourself probably the only woman, I imagine. And how did you overcome some of those? I have to say that it would be kind of difficulties initially, especially as you're looking across the table at your counterparts, who I'm sure were primarily male groups as well. So what was that experience like, and how did you kind of overcome some of those early barriers and challenges?
Yes, so that is definitely true. And certainly it was true when I started, and it continues to be true today, although things are changing, and that's a great thing. I have to say that I don't know that I dwelt on it very much. It was the case, but I was there to do a job, and that's what I did. But I have to say that it was also really important to me that I had great support from my colleagues, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And who they were. I had wonderful mentors and sponsors at the firm. And I think that's one of the reasons that I've been there for so long. But they were sensitive to the issue, and they were open to talking about it, talking about it very openly. And I do remember, them saying, and it meant a lot at the time, that kind of they had my back in this, and that they felt that, they were 100% supportive, and that they felt that the clients, Japanese clients in particular here, were going to take their cues from my colleagues. And, at the time I was a junior lawyer, but that, they would look to see how I was being treated and regarded by the senior attorneys on the team. And that if they treated me with respect and, you know, had clearly had confidence in me, that would go a long way. And I think it did. And I am forever grateful for that support.
That's great. And now we see why you're there for 32 years.
Mm-hmm.
They clearly have had your back. So we want to switch now, and we'd love to learn a little bit more about your family. We've heard, you've told us a lot about your deep connection to your grandparents and your parents, and you have this really fascinating connection to Japanese culture and, you know, your unique intergenerational experience that you've had with your parents and your grandparents. How are you carrying that forward to your children? And the reason we're curious is so many people connected with USJC, myself included, I have two sons. We're always challenged and we're always looking for ways of making those connections. And as our parents and grandparents are passing on, you know, we lose that. So how have you approached it as a mom, as a parent?
Right. Well, I think it's been in our family quite natural. And I've been very thankful for, you know, the opportunities we've had. So as I mentioned earlier, because my mother watched my kids and my grandparents were around, and, you know, so my kids saw their great grandmother practically every day, certainly every day of the week, the weekdays. And so, you know, she was around. So we had NHK on TV all the time. So the Japanese language was around. She only spoke Japanese until the day she died. She never really made an attempt to learn English. And so they certainly had the language around, but so much of the culture as well. As you can see, this is a Hinamatsuri set, a Girls' Day set that actually belongs to my mother. And so is 80 some years old from before the war. And she handed it down to my daughter. But so, you know, we had the language, we have the food, we have the holidays, we do osechidori every New Year's and invite, a bunch of people over. My kids went to Japanese school on Saturdays and, you know, with differing levels of commitment and dedication and enthusiasm, depending on the child and the time, you know, the period in their life, but all of them through high school, or through at least portions of high school. And it was a very low-key school. They didn't come out fluent or anything, but it was a way for them, you know, they certainly know their hiragana, katakana, and some kanji, and, you know, they can listen more than they can speak, but we've definitely made an effort. And we've also made it a point, I think, to share the culture with their communities and with their classmates at school. So, you know, from the time they were in, preschool, we were doing these little cultural demonstrations, and it would be myself and my mother and my grandmother, and we'd all go into the classroom, and we would do, you know, calligraphy. We would make little ema. We would do Japanese flower arranging with these are Chinese takeout little black containers with styrofoam glued into them. And we would, you know, take carnations and some, branches of something, and the kids would play with it. But, you know, we would talk about some of the principles of ikebana, and they would learn a little bit. So, you know, with my daughter, we would do a Hinamatsuri party every year. And the girls would come, and we'd have the dolls out, and we'd do some sort of craft that was related to Japan. They'd often put on yukata, and, you know, and so to share it was a way of my children, you know, identifying with it, but also taking pride in it. And so I think they feel very close in many ways to their Japanese American heritage and to, you know, Japanese American and Japanese culture.
Before we
There's
move on, we wanted to show a couple of photos of your more recent photos of your children and your family.
oh,
Seems that you're really close.
oh yeah, yeah. No, they are. We are grateful that our kids seem to like to come home and seem to enjoy each other, and we certainly enjoy them. So, and our
Talk a little bit about your community involvement. And I know that especially after the kids have moved away from home, you have a little more time, you know? And so what areas of interest do you have, and how have you been fulfilling that interest in terms of just your involvement with the community? Here's one more photo of you and your husband and the kids.
Yeah, this is in Patagonia, Chile. So I love the outdoors and nature, and the more remote and the more wild and the more wildlife, all the better. And that's also something, kind of a love of nature that we've tried to instill in our kids as well. So when you're talking about communities, I guess you're talking about other communities or just sort of communities at large, or
Whatever you feel community involvement, your definition, and how you guys have remained active.
yeah. So I think many different dimensions, I guess. I do feel like it's important that we give back and that we can, contribute. And so, at the firm, for instance, I'm involved in certainly firm management issues, but pro bono work. And I feel very grateful to be at a firm that values pro bono and believes it's really important that lawyers give back and, provide pro bono services to give access to the legal system to people who might not otherwise afford it. So I am, through my conservation work or interest in conservation, I do some actually litigation work related to that. But I also work with, do a lot of immigration work, in particular with an organization that helps women and girls who are fleeing violence. And I also act as guardian ad litem to children in Washington, D.C. who are either in abuse and neglect cases or contested custody cases. So we do that. We've been very involved in our kids' schools and also with Stanford. And, at Stanford, we support their School of Earth, which again is kind of environmental, but also support opportunities to fund internships, for kids who might not otherwise be able to take an unpaid internship to give them that kind of experience. And we've been involved. I've been involved at the firm and with my kids' school on diversity and equity issues, and certainly, particularly with the events of the last year, I feel that those issues are just so important, and that we're making progress. The conversation is progressing, but it is such a complicated and difficult and emotional area. And I feel like as a country and as a society, we have so much work to do there. So that's an area that is very near and dear to my heart.
Sorry, there's a pause here. I was just sort of thinking about some of the things that you said. One thing that you have been very involved in that we know of is the Japanese American National Museum and USJC, harkening back a little bit more to your ancestry. I know that you've been very active with Jana, but I'm more interested right now with your relationship with USJC. And tell me why you got involved in USJC and why that's important to you.
Right. So actually, my involvement with USJC does sort of harken back to Janum, because that is where I first got to know Irene. But I've been on the board of governors, and then very recently on the board of trustees at JANM for a very, very long time. And that is, very much, it's very important. And I should have mentioned it when we were discussing kind of involvement with community. But it was through, I think, knowing Irene through JANM that, I got involved with USJC. And, I can remember the lunch I had with Irene. She invited me to lunch, and it wasn't quite clear what the purpose of the lunch was. But when I got there, it was pretty clear that this was to explore, whether I would get involved with USJC. And it was a really wonderful lunch. And I was just impressed with Irene's, it was so clear from that lunch and then forward, Irene's absolute commitment to the US-Japan Council, and how much she cared about the organization and the mission. And I thought it was really admirable, that she took the time to have lunch with me to describe the organization and, its mission and so forth, but also to kind of feel me out and see whether, I was going to be a good fit for the organization. And I, for me, with having grown up with so much connection to Japan and the Japanese culture and so forth, it was a very easy a decision for me. And I view my involvement at USJC to be in part kind of a tribute to my grandparents and their legacy and, a country that they came from and a cultural heritage that they so loved and that they passed on to me. And then, of course, my time, in Japan, both as a young person and then as a professional, building those bridges, another act of diplomacy, but, just it feels like a very, very natural thing. And I think that the USJC operates on several different important levels. One is creating the connection among the Japanese American community and creating this national network of Japanese Americans. I think that is really very special. I think, I did go on the Japanese American leadership delegation in 2011, it was the year of the earthquake. But, it is a short period of time. You're only in Japan for a week with group, but it's such an intensive experience and such an amazing experience getting to meet with and talk to people at the highest levels of Japanese government and business and civil society. But you really feel this kinship, and what struck me at my JALD, was getting to know everyone, was the multiplicity of stories. We all came with different stories, and I'm sure you're seeing this in your interviews as well. Everyone has a very unique story and a very unique connection to, their Japanese American heritage, however deep or shallow it might be. And then, their exploration of that through US-Japan Council, that we all had these different stories, but there was this through line of this commonality of this shared heritage that I think, drew us together. And of course, with JALD, you feel very close to your own class, but you come home and become part of this family of, everyone who's been in this program. And, when you get together at the annual conference or at different meetings, it really is this opportunity. It's a kind of a family reunion. And I love that we're, very intentionally developing kind of the younger generation as well. So, at the annual conference, Jan Yanahira's, interviews with Japanese Americans, I just feel that's one of my favorite parts of the conference. I feel kind of like the room gets quiet, and it's like we all gather around the fireplace and we hear stories. And so often we are highlighting the stories of the younger, generation and leaders in our community. And I love that about US Japan Council. And of course, the US Japan dimension of it is another dimension, and very, very important. And I think that the idea, and I think it's very fundamental to USJC, but fundamental to the relationship, the people to people and the individual connections, and the multitude of programs that we have, spanning legislators and, young people, and the Tomodachi programs, and all of that is just so wonderful. And it's all very much a tribute, I think, to Irene and her vision for the organization and the relationship.
So Susan, our last question is this. You've talked so much and referenced your heritage, the cultural values in which you were raised. What are the fundamental values that you hold dear and close to you, and that you live your life by?
Okay. So over the years, I've really honed in on two specific values that I feel are very, very important, and certainly guide my life. One is respect. And I truly believe that we owe each other respect. That we, and that it's a recognition for me of the common humanity. I know it sounds really like cliche perhaps, but I truly, truly believe that. And it is, for me, I feel like every person has their story, and I can learn something from every individual that I encounter. And I think that if we exercised more respect, for our environment, for other living things, for other people, I feel like a lot of the issues, the division in our country and in our world, we'd be in a better place. And the second one for me is honesty. And for me, that means really it's an intellectual rigor in terms of honesty, in sort of honesty with yourself, and honesty with other people. And that goes along with the respect, I think. But I feel like if you're honest with yourself, you kind of end up in the right place, and then honest with other people. It's kind of an integrity, and I think the combination of respect and honesty allows us to speak truth to ourselves and to each other, including truth to power. I think that becomes much more natural, and is simply just kind of the through line. That's where you end up if you kind of abide by these values. So for me, those are kind of my North Stars.
Well, Susan, we want to thank you very much for your time and sitting with us today and sharing your story. We've run out of time, but thank you so much,
Absolutely.
much. We also want to thank everyone who's joining us today. Your support for the U.S. Japan Council and programs like this enable us to continue bringing you programs. We hope you've enjoyed today's dialogue with Susan. Please check out our other interviews in this series, available on USJC's website and also on YouTube. Thank you.